Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 311 of Humanity Rising. Today, we want to explore the frontier of longevity. You know, we humans are used to thinking that we have an average lifespan of 70, 80 years, that death is inevitable, and we can see the end of our journey almost from the beginning, and we accept that as normal. Those of you who know your Bible know that in the book of Genesis, after the flood, the Lord God said that he would not strive forever with humanity and set the time of our lifespan to 120 years. And that implied that before that time, human beings lived to be a lot older. And in fact, if you look at the ancient Sumerian king lists in Egypt and different parts of the world, in deep antiquity, there was this memory that at the beginning of human presence here on the earth, people lived for tens of thousands of years. There was one king that reigned for 36,000 years. So when we look at the issue of longevity, which we want to explore today, let us approach this subject of how long we endure on this earth with an open mind. It may be that the average lifespan currently available to us of 75, 80 years, depending on where you are around the world, is something that is completely malleable. So let's contemplate that with someone who's done an extraordinary amount of research and exploration of this domain of longevity. Before we jump into this topic, let us pause, as we always do, and just simply take note of our bodies. When our bodies stop, we stop, or at least we get radically reformulated. And take a deep breath, close your eyes, and place your attention on your heart. And if you can, just attune and listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you, I want to welcome to our program Dr. Todd Ovikatis. He was trained in medicine at Johns Hopkins University and Georgetown University. He was at the top of his class. He then went out to California and began to explore energy medicine. Had an experience where he was able to communicate with the consciousness of DNA and proceeded to develop some laser-based platform, interdimensional platform that enabled him to explore some of the potentials in stem cell biology. And through Dr. Ovikatis's learning and training and explorations, he began to probe the domain of longevity and what it means for people to live and to die, what happens in the death process, how we can transform our consciousness and our DNA to extend human life. And he's been on Humanity Rising before, so you will know him. He does some Lemurian chanting, so he's in all kinds of nooks and crannies of human awareness, history, and potential. So Todd, I want to welcome you back to Humanity Rising. And we are all very excited to learn what you know about the possibility of extending human life. What a wonderful thing that would be, because life is wonderful. And to live it large and to live it fully and to be able to live it beyond the limitations, the biblical injunction of only 120 years would be a wonderful thing. So welcome to our program. And Todd will show us a PowerPoint that he has specially prepared for us. And then I'll circle back. I'll be tracking the comments and questions that you may have in the chat box, and then we'll have a dialogue for the balance of our time. Todd, welcome.
Hi, Jim. A great pleasure and honor being on with you at Ubiquity again. And I have a veritable wealth of information to share with all of you today. So, as you said, our work really is multidimensional. I'll be presenting things that are what you would call scientific and both basic science and clinical studies, and also the more esoteric side of the equation. What happens with ancient interdimensional sounds and sound patterns, and even psycho-emotional medicine, where literally if one finds the core conflict, whether it's yours or your ancestors, that can unlock a whole new state of health and well-being. So I'll make the point that this is going to be a multidimensional discussion, because I believe if we're going to personally achieve higher states of awareness, greater abilities, greater depths of being, and as is the title of this program, Longer Life, then you really need to explore all avenues and do the best of everything. So, are we ready to begin with the slides and information? Okay, so just to check from you all, is that my first slide?
Yeah, you look good, Todd.
Excellent. Well, the program title, and I have to thank Jim for co-creating this with me, is Longevity Reimagined, Exploring the Concept for a New Humanity. And I'd say that this creation of humanity is always a personal and collective process. So whenever we make a step forward, or anyone makes a step forward, the whole is brought to another level. And what I'm going to be providing are many ways that you can literally continually create enhanced versions of yourself. And with the Grand Master work I'm now studying, because I have the great pleasure and privilege of working with only one of a handful of Grand Masters in the world, who trained in a Chinese tradition going back 5,000 years to Lao Tzu through an unbroken chain of Grand Masters. He's the first and only such master to be allowed to leave China and share the information, that it's the notion that if we follow certain disciplines and use certain techniques, we can be continually expanding, not just in one area like finances or health or intelligence or relationships, that we can be expanding on all of those fronts all the time without any limit. And I want to encourage those of you who are listening that are interested in longevity and what our potential is to stay with me to the end, because there I'll present our pioneering work with stem cells. And the divine has provided us an extraordinary gift, a type of cell that is created in our bodies while we're in gestation, that for mysterious reasons goes into hibernation at or around the time that we're born, that carries these newborn stem cells throughout our life, but they stay asleep. And we have, through this interdimensional technology that Jim described, we have unlocked the code, the keys to awaken these cells, as well as to direct them where to go in the body. And this opens extraordinary new potentials in longevity. And I'll share that because it literally cracks the code and makes the biblical levels of longevity not just a wish for a dream, but it's becoming an immediate reality. And we start this discussion with some really cool physics. And this segment I would call Unsticking the Arrow of Time, Opening a Matrix of New Potentials. And this has to do with the work we do with lasers, and my love for lasers began when I was 8 years old. I began studying them. I could tell you that laser meant light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. And from there, I built my first quantum time machine when I was 10 years old. And then when I was 13, fell in love with DNA and everything about it. And even then realized that if we understood everything about DNA, that we could literally rescript our lifespans and our health. And as Jim Garrison had described, in my own process, I had a vision where I communicated with what I would call the pure consciousness of DNA, and that gave rise to the technology that I'm going to share now. So the basic way that lasers work is that the technology creates waves of light that are basically of the same wavelength. That's not technically exact, but that's a more advanced discussion. For understanding, the waves created are of the same wavelength, and they're also produced in a way that they are in phase. And when you add waves together in phase, you, by algebraic summation, get an amplified wave. And that gives the merits of all the myriad things that lasers do for us in modern technology. And through that vision, what our team was inspired to create is a new type of laser, or even more precisely, a new type of waveform, where we are able to pair the waves not in phase, but to pair them exactly out of phase, and even adjust the percentage of the laser output that's in this wave anti-wave configuration. And as you can see, when you add those waves together, you get basically a net zero, a straight line. So what this means is two visible waves are going in and invisible light is coming out. And I've had physicists tell me where there's no energy, and as you students know from conservation of energy, things we learned in grade school, that energy is neither created nor destroyed. So the energy is still present, it's just in a different configuration or different form. And perhaps the most provocative interpretation of that is that an equivalent wave structure is the waves are back in phase again, but the waves are going in opposite directions. So we see a wave going to the right, and conventional understanding would be, well, that wave is going forward in space, but also going forward in time. The wave going in the other direction to the left, even according to conventional quantum mechanics, is not only going backwards in space, it is going backwards in time. And if we're thinking longevity, well, how cool is that? If you can reverse the flow of time, well, then perhaps you can reverse the flow of aging itself. And through the presentation, especially at the end, I'm going to show you what's already been achieved and what is perhaps the forerunner of achieving much enhanced lifespans. We're believing we can at least double that. And when you see all the data, you'll say, well, with that new information, that's even plausible. What's interesting, relating this to DNA, is that a photon, which if you've studied electromagnetism in physics, is conventionally shown as a sine wave with an electric field that oscillates on one axis, and in phase at right angles to it, you have a magnetic wave that is traveling. In addition to that, photons undergo what are called polarization changes. So as a wave of light is going towards you, it is also going through a cycle of polarization. So when we create a spiral counter spiral of light, it in essence is going much like DNA. It's a configuration literally with a spiral counter spiral. So what we've created with this new laser waveform is literally structurally of the same type of geometry as DNA. And as we know from resonance relationships, if things have the same structure, they will tend to interact with each other and resonate with each other. So you can say we've also created a type of quantum interdimensional DNA communicator. This is a beautiful model that was constructed by hand by the famous actor who is a star of the show Empire, who was Iron Man's friend in the first Iron Man movie, Terrence Howard. And his acting revenues go towards his real passion, which is sacred geometry. And he believes that Platonic solids aren't exactly as we've learned, that in nature, you don't see the creation of straight lines. He believes the Platonic solids actually have curved sides. And this is one of the geometries based on that. And the spiral counter spiral with, in the more advanced understanding of a waveform, the residual of light is also little islands of constructive interference that we call sparse constructive nodes. That little video gives a representation of what the complexity of our waveform looks like and behaves like. This work began, this pursuit of creating a new type of laser, was with the desire to find a non-chemical way to neutralize HIV, also known as the AIDS virus. And this happened when I was in my training at Georgetown as a pulmonary fellow in the intensive care units of Georgetown. And I was doing a lot of bronchoscopies on AIDS patients because when they get pneumonia, it's often not just one thing, like people with healthy immune systems. It can be 2 or 3 or even 5 different things. So you have to do invasive procedures. You have to wash the air sacs of the lung and even do biopsies so you can have a comprehensive diagnosis. And I had an inspired thought, which is that if somehow the nucleic acid of HIV configured itself geometrically differently than human nucleic acid, based on the concept in physics known as natural frequency, which is that every structure from a bond between 2 atoms to a skyscraper to a whole planet everything that is physical based on its geometry and its composition has what's called a natural frequency, the fundamental frequency at which it will vibrate when you stimulate it. So the idea was if we could define a vibrational difference between human nucleic acid and that of a virus, that we could literally create a field pattern that would resonate with it, and you might be able to inactivate a virus with pure frequency alone. So these are our first experiments that we did at USC with one of the co-authors of the initial AIDS discovery paper. He's a Syed Zaki Salahuddin, who kindly invited me into his lab to do this work. And what we see here is a photomicrograph of a type of immune cell that is infected by HIV. It's not just the so-called CD4 or helper lymphocytes that are infected, it's also the monocytes. And this actually is one of the reasons that it makes it difficult to completely eliminate HIV from the body, because these serve as a reservoir and they live longer and they're more robust. And they also cross the blood-brain barrier, giving some of the cognitive issues with HIV. So this is what those cells look like in their native uninfected state. And after infection with the virus, you see that the nuclei remain about the same. The cytoplasm has blown up immensely. And we see a bunch of little sacs, which are areas of virus that's being formed within the cell. And the membrane looks roughly because that is the appearance created when little bits of cytoplasm are budding off as viruses are being formed. When we created a system where we tuned the frequencies for HIV, we used a carrier wave based on some biophysics modeling by a researcher named Callahan, who looked at the GP120 glycoprotein external spikes of HIV, and he defined what he called the primary coherent wavelength of HIV at roughly 71 angstroms. And that, of course, is ionizing radiation, so we had to use harmonics of that. And when we doubled up, we came to a blue wavelength of light as the carrier wave, and the wave anti-wave signal of that light, when applied to these cells in a culture medium for 15 minutes, 6 days later, we saw this appearance. So there was a significant reversion of appearance and behavior to looking much more normal. And the carrier wave alone, we saw a roughly 80% reduction of production of virus. We then did more targeting, and we defined through supercomputing the frequencies of the various amino acids. And then we targeted a replication protein in HIV called the zinc finger protein, which has a particular sequence of amino acids around a zinc atom. And when we created a complex enough signal, we were able to get inhibition of viral production below the threshold of detectability. In a sense, it was literally the alleviation of HIV at a level that would be considered an effective therapy. And that is defined technically as a 90% reduction of viral production, or a 1 log reduction of production. And we achieved significantly more than that just by applying this methodology. Now, because of the challenges of doing all the R&D and regulatory approvals, we defined a way to make this laser vibration available, which was doing the research to define a number of antiviral herbs from the Amazon. And when we treated those herbs with the frequencies that were effective in the test tube, and then combined that with nutritional substance, we saw some interesting things. So here we see a person who was in the last stages of HIV. His CD4 count was an end stage level of 10, and a normal CD4 count is 600. Below 200 is the definition of AIDS. And when it gets to very low levels like 10, that means that it's very end stage and the prognosis is poor. At this point, it was maybe about 1 month to live. Yet taking these photoacoustically enhanced substances, 6 months later, he was alive and well with improved metrics. And as we can see, he looks a lot better. And there he's being embraced by Winnie Mandela, considered the mother of the South African people who kept things going while Nelson Mandela was in prison. Her affectionate name there is Ndlovukazi, which means mother elephant, a compliment there, not necessarily in America. And this is just an example of the combination of nutrition and vibration to get significant benefits. To understand the next data that I'm going to share, this is a chart of the typical course of HIV infection. The solid dark line shows the so-called CD4 or helper lymphocyte count. And what's relevant for those who haven't studied this area, CD4 lymphocytes are required for the body to be able to find and eliminate viruses. So HIV very cleverly literally takes out the part of the immune system that would be needed to get rid of it. And as we see over the course of time, the CD4 count tends to drop. Below 600 is pre-AIDS, below 200 is AIDS. And as you can see, the lower the count gets, the shorter the prognosis remains. The dashed line is the viral load that occurs over time. There's an initial spike, and the immune system gets it somewhat under control, and it drops. But then over time, you can see the viral load tends to go higher and higher. Our most dramatic case using this immune support protocol with the vibrationally enhanced botanicals from the Amazon and other nutrients to support immune recovery is a person who started with a viral load over 200,000. And 5 years after using this protocol, he had an undetectable viral load rated at less than 40. Now, the next slide shows what happened with the CD4 count. He initially was at 23, which gave him a prognosis of perhaps a few months to live. And he was one of those persons who decided not to take the antiretroviral. So this is sort of a pure case of just what this vibrational and herbal configuration and support nutrients provided for him. After 6 months, his CD4 count was roughly 250, so he crossed the threshold of the AIDS definition. And then 5 years later, we can see that his CD4 count had increased to a high level of over 1,100. So this may be the first case of someone with end-stage, very symptomatic HIV infection with a complete immunologic, symptomatic, and clinical recovery just using vibrationally enhanced botanicals. So that's just a single case. And we were then kindly invited to work in a village in Kenya where HIV was particularly prevalent. And that was a group of 25 persons whose average CD4 count was 331 in the pre-AIDS level on the way to the 200 threshold. And in just 3 months of using this supplemental formulation, the CD4 count increased all the way to 554, or nearly to the normal level. And that was highly statistically significant. What's particularly interesting is the level of increase of the CD4 counts. Now, I spoke to one of the main HIV clinical doctors in Kenya, And he said that when persons go on the ARV drugs, the antiretroviral drugs, the typical increase in CD4 counts over 3 months is 25 to 35. When persons were on the drugs plus used the formula, instead of a 35-point increase, the average was 159. In the subset of persons only on the immune support protocol, the average increase was even greater, 239. So it suggests that while the antiretroviral drugs were effective at suppressing the viral load, they still had perhaps somewhat of an immune suppressant effect from their actions themselves. And that just using literally botanical solutions plus this vibrational configuration that in the test tube was very effective for neutralizing HIV, we got an even greater response. And this was that project in Kenya called Sawa Sawa, which basically means project feeling really great. One of the methodologies that we used to support the immune recovery is an area of nutritional medicine that's only starting to be better understood and appreciated. And that has to do with the supplementation of DNA and RNA, the nucleic acid bases themselves. And this is a longevity study which gets into the potentials for dramatic increases in the human lifespan. This was a study by a Dr. Max Odens, who began with old rats. And these rats normally live to be about 800 to 900 days. So starting the experiment with animals that were at day 750 was like starting a longevity experiment with people that were 90 years old. So sort of at the end of the line. And the control animals, as anticipated, lived no more than the usual 150 days more. In contrast, the animals that were treated with once a week injections of DNA and RNA, whereas the control animals after 6 to 8 weeks were looking even worse. They lost muscle mass, they were less active, had no libido, their fur was diminishing. After that period of time, the treated animals actually looked younger and more vibrant. They regained muscle mass, their hair regrew, they became more physically active, they regained their libido and related activities. The result of this was that the minimum additional longevity was 850 days. So the minimum result was literally doubling the lifespan of these older animals. And the highest result was a 1,500 additional day lifespan, nearly tripling the natural lifespan of the animal. And as you can see, because they were old, it increased the remaining longevity by a factor of up to 10-fold more. So based on this information, we created a formula after the biblical figure Methuselah, who, for those of you who have done your homework in this area, in Genesis 5:27, it was stated that Methuselah lived to be 969 years old. So as a recorded stated reference point, that would be the hallmark of the greatest human longevity, at least in a well-read documented volume. And this formulation, in order to get better delivery, is in solution so that the absorption can be quite rapid. And to validate the efficacy, we did a placebo-controlled double-blind study. And this was in middle-aged men who are a little overweight. And the protocol was really quite simple. They took 6 sprays of the formula, either the active formula or the placebo, and that was followed by the direction to do 30 minutes of brisk walking. So most people can walk 30 minutes a day. Not everyone, but most people can manage that. And the results were very interesting. The control group, after 60 days or 2 months, showed very little change in body composition, little change in weight or muscle mass, and no change in aerobic fitness. In contrast, the active treatment group using this formula Methuselah showed an astonishing 15-pound increase in muscle mass, which is really huge, while being 10 pounds less in their overall weight, which some would suggest reducing 25 pounds of not useful weight while making the body much healthier with more muscle. And as you may know, muscle mass is considered one of the major biomarkers of biological age. And getting this much muscle mass would be roughly tantamount to being 8 to 12 years younger biologically. So for 60 days and walking 30 minutes, that's a very profound result. And because those results were so significant, I wrote a book called Growing Younger. And looking more deeply into the study of supplemental nucleic acids, the DNA and RNA bases themselves, and just for understanding this DNA RNA formula that we've described does not have chains of nucleic acids. It's not intact DNA and RNA. It is the single individual bases. So it's not informational, it's literally giving the building blocks so the body has what it needs. Now, the issue is that nutritional science for years has said we don't need to supplement DNA and RNA or nucleic acids because the body can actually make its own from amino acids and other simple substrates. However, more recent work has shown that under stress or even the aging process itself, the body loses the ability to make enough DNA and RNA for optimum cell regeneration because it takes a lot of nucleic acids if you want to make new cells. So this book, Growing Younger, goes into a significant body of research on the many benefits that studies have shown of supplemental nucleic acids. One of the most interesting ones was a study where, wasn't a very nice study, where they subjected lab animals to high doses of radiation. And these doses were so high that there was only a 5% survival in the animals. When they were given supplemental nucleic acids, their survival increased from 5% to 50%. So any person's concerned about radiation exposure, this is one way to create a significant biological support and protective effect. There's another study, I believe in mice, where they created a serious staph infection and survival increased from about 29% to about 70% if the supplemental nucleic acids were given. So for those of you who would like the details and the referencing, not just of the Methuselah formula, but of other formulas that we have created that we have subjected to controlled clinical trials, you can have a free download of this book at drtado.com/humanity. And for those of you that may be interested in this range of supplements that are also enhanced with the laser technology, that those are available at Germatria.com. Now, I think Jim will appreciate the term Germatria because the root goes all the way back to the term when it was called Gematria. And that goes back to the ancient mystery schools. And that was a method of converting the letters and words into numbers and then decoding the pattern of information in the number sequence. So literally it was a way of translating information from one realm to another to another. And that has further evolved in understanding. My work in this area was further enhanced by a very interesting book called The Keys of Enoch, the Book of Knowledge by J.J. Hurtak. And it's interesting, there's a part in the book where it actually describes the technology we're using that creates a vector sum zero of electromagnetic or EM fields. And in this book, he defines Germatria as the science of determining the input energy required to build a body of consciousness. So these formulas are about physical health and also about enhancing brain and cognitive and vibrational functions for an enhancement of consciousness state itself. Those of you who study geometry, particularly sacred geometry, will recognize this figure. This is called a star tetrahedron. In esoteric circles, it's also called the structure of the Merkabah. And that is defined as counterposed, counter-rotating fields of light that balance body, mind, and being. It's described as a vehicle that activates at certain states of consciousness. And for example, when Elijah ascended to the sky as in a chariot of fire, it's believed that it was the activation of this structure that made that possible. The biology of DNA and aging itself has two fundamental aging clocks. The one that is best known is called telomeres, which are the ends of the chromosomes. And as the cells divide, the telomeres chip off a little with each division and get shorter and shorter. The typically used metaphor is that it's like the ends of shoelaces. And when those get too worn out, then the laces themselves fray. Well, it's similar with DNA. When the telomeres get too short, the cells stop dividing, goes into senescence, and that is one of the main things that limits the human lifespan. The other DNA aging clock, which isn't as well known generally, is called DNA methylation. And the Merkabah is interesting because a methyl group looks like a little tetrahedral pyramid. And I'll show what that looks like in a moment. DNA methylation is relevant because when we're born, each type of cell that is differentiated has a unique methylation pattern. And the methylation basically tells the cell not to transcribe one set of genes or another. This is how the body differentiates the function, for example, of a neuron versus a kidney cell versus a heart muscle cell. And when roughly 40% of the methyl groups that we are born with have fallen off, just like when the telomere is shortened by about 50%, that is what creates the end of the human lifespan by virtue of the DNA aging clock. This image is a thin film crystal of glycine, which is the amino acid, one of the 20 basic amino acids, that is itself methylated into this structure called trimethylglycine, also known as betaine. And as you can see, it has not one, not two, but three methyl groups, which are little pyramids with carbon in the center and hydrogen at the corners. This shows betaine that is crystallized without any other stimulus by slow evaporation. Whereas if it's crystallized under the influence of the laser, we see much more beautiful, organized crystalline pattern. At the level of single crystals, we see the one that was grown without the laser is irregular with pits and holes in it, whereas the one generated by the laser is a very pure crystal without defects. Even more profoundly, if we look at X-ray crystallography, the dark lines in the model above show the control betaine without laser stimulation, whereas the dashed lines show an actual stretching of the bond angles. So in essence, that suggests going from a lower vibrational state of the methyl groups to a higher vibrational state. So one could consider these to be, in all probability, more biologically active methyl groups. And this is important when we get down into the core chemistry. So if we're talking about extremes of longevity, DNA methylation is critically important. This pathway not only maintains the methyl groups on DNA in a more youthful condition, it also protects and preserves the length of the telomeres. So to understand this somewhat complex metabolic pathway, it's easiest just to focus on homocysteine, which is in the middle of the picture. And there are three ways the body has to detoxify homocysteine. I'll go into the evidence that homocysteine is not beneficial. So first, going upwards is the well-known pathway through B12 and folic acid, which converts this into methionine. There's another pathway which is very powerful and important that occurs to the liver and kidneys through an enzyme known as betaine homocysteine methyltransferase, quite a mouthful. And the betaine, or trimethylglycine, donates a methyl group to remethylate homocysteine to methionine. And this is important because methionine then combines with the energy molecule ATP to do something known as SAMe, the long phrase being S-adenosylmethionine. What's critically important about SAMe is that this is the exclusive methyl group donor in the body that's used to remethylate DNA. So if you want to stay young a long time, you really want to be maintaining the methyl groups on DNA as well as telomere length. In addition to being rejuvenating for DNA, this can also rejuvenate proteins through an enzyme known as protein isospartyl methyltransferase. It makes the membrane lipids more youthful, enhances carbohydrates, is used to build the myelin sheaths. It detoxifies organic chemicals, histamine, and even heavy metals, participates in making neurotransmitters, particularly building serotonin and others. Now, SAMe is vitally important, and what we found was that if we gave someone a reasonably big dose of SAMe, roughly 800 milligrams per day, it gave them a low normal level of SAMe. In contrast, if we gave them a formulation of this laser-enhanced trimethylglycine and other cofactors, without giving additional SAMe, we drove the SAMe levels to a high normal level. And this graph just shows that the aging process is associated with a gradual loss of methyl groups, and at the end of the lifespan is about when 40% of those groups have diminished from DNA. The relevance of homocysteine is this. This is a chart of homocysteine level versus cardiac risk. And we see that an optimal level is about 6.3, or we say less than 7. When the homocysteine has risen to a level of only 10, that doubles the risk of a cardiac event. And at 15, it's 4 times the risk. And at a level of 20, it's roughly 9 times the risk. So homocysteine has now been recognized as a major cardiac risk factor that may be as more important than cholesterol levels. So we did a placebo-controlled double-blind study of this formulation, driven particularly by activated TMG with the other relevant cofactors from the metabolic chart included. And we saw that as we increased the dose from 2 to 4 to 6 grams per day, that we got a progressive reduction of homocysteine to an optimal level of 7 or below, as low as 6.1. And each of those reductions was highly statistically significant. In contrast, the placebo control group showed no significant change in their homocysteine level. The high homocysteine subset was particularly relevant because the level dropped from 13 to an optimal level of 7.3. Now, there are large population studies that show homocysteine values that tend to rise with age. This is roughly the homocysteine value of what's expected for a 60-year-old, going to that of roughly a 30-year-old. We did a methodology called a system checklist 90 that asked 90 questions about state of well-being. And we saw that the anxiety scale was significantly reduced statistically at all dosage levels, whereas there was no significant change in the placebo group. Depression was significantly reduced, and we might expect that because one of the things this pathway does is build serotonin, or the happy molecule, in the brain. Somatization refers to body aches and pains, and this was dramatically reduced even at the lowest intake levels. It was interesting, just before our study, there was a paper published showing that elevated homocysteine correlates with high human hostility. And so we actually showed a parallel between reducing homocysteine levels and reduced human hostility. So if everybody took this, we could all get along better. And this is the global severity index. So for all symptoms taken together, we see that lowering homocysteine had a highly statistically significant effect of all the characteristics of the quality of life across the board. We did additional work that was done with a dentist who showed that using this formula also significantly reduced the load of heavy metals. And if you were really watching closely to the metabolic diagram, the other pathway of the detox of homocysteine is called transsulfuration, which generates the amino acid cysteine, which then is one of the 3 amino acids that create the compound known as glutathione, which is probably the most significant anti-aging, anti-tumor, antioxidant within the cells. And glutathione, as a sulfur compound, can bind to heavy metals. What we saw was that mercury in particular, through GI elimination, had a roughly 300 to 500% increase in eliminating mercury from the body. And we also saw significant elimination of lead, arsenic, tungsten, uranium, and other heavy metals, almost all of them across the board. So in addition to being a formulation to enhance methyl groups, it also has significant heavy metal detox and other organic compound detox. The name of the formula that this goes under is called Heart Gems. And we call it that because there is such a significant reduction of cardiovascular risks as homocysteine levels drop. And really, we probably should call it pro-SAMI because increasing SAMI does many more things than just improve cardiac health. It assists all the other systems, as the study indicates. Another aspect of living a very long time in a healthy body is having clear and clean blood vessels. And this is a diagram that shows that the blood vessels are kept in their states of relative dilation through a very interesting compound called nitric oxide. And this is largely derived in the body through the amino acid known as L-arginine. Among the interesting things that arginine-derived nitric oxide does is also the use by different types of immune cells to create what are described as literal bullets of nitric oxide gas that can eliminate bacteria and other types of pathogens. The Nobel laureate, Dr. Luis Ignarro, who won the Nobel Prize for the work on arginine-derived nitric oxide, basically said that this molecule does everything everywhere. It's also required for long-term memory. When is forming a long-term memory, literally billowing clouds of nitric oxide gas go over the nerves and allow a retracing like an Etch-a-Sketch called long-term potentiation so that we can have long-term memories. So it's been postulated that for age-related memory decline, this can be one of the antidotes or even allow the reversal of that. What we see here are crystals of arginine that were created without the laser versus those crystallized under the influence. We see, much more delicate, elegant crystalline structures. Even more relevant is X-ray crystallography shows that we have created a uniform field of elongated side chains. And of the amino acids, arginine has one of the longest side chains, which may be prone to bending and folding, which makes it less efficient. One of our theories of how we enhance the bioavailability of the compounds that have been treated with this interdimensional laser system is that it creates a uniform field. It homogenizes the nutrients to a uniform elongated shape and structure, which tends to be optimum for how they work with the enzymes that metabolize them. We did a controlled clinical trial of the laser-enhanced arginine formula that has other cofactors for its metabolic pathways. That formulation is called nitrox. And this clinical trial was published in the prestigious Russian medical journal. And I'll read the Russian for it. That's Cardiologia. So this is the cardiology version of the journal. And this is the study, which is Opyt kliniczego przymienienia aminokislotnego kompleksu nitrax i bolnych z ischemicznej boleżnią serca. And you see under that my name in Russian Cyrillic, Todd Ovikatis. And the translation of that is the report of a clinical study using the amino acid complex nitrox to improve cardiac function in ischemic heart disease. So the participants in this study had already had one or more myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, which made them a particularly at-risk group. Because in that setting, if there's a recurrence of chest pain, either with exertion or at rest, it suggests an unstable situation, which can be medically quite serious. And what we see is that over 30 days, the placebo control group had very little change in their chest pain with exertion, whereas those taking roughly 3 grams of the photoacoustically enhanced arginine showed a roughly 80% reduction in this symptom. So adding this to their general medical program create a significant improvement in results. The most severe or worrisome symptom in ischemic heart disease is so-called rest angina, chest pain that occurs even at rest, which is generally quite unstable and suggests a serious obstruction event of a blood vessel may occur, creating potential for another heart attack and its complications. And even chest pain at rest was significantly improved, roughly 70%, whereas the placebo control group showed no significant change. What's also of interest for quality of life is maximum exercise capacity. So in the first 30 days of this study, the subjects just got placebo, and we see that there is roughly a 10% reduction in their maximum capacity. In contrast, after 30 days of the active formula, we saw a roughly 60% increase in maximum exercise capacity. So they were able to work out significantly more. And that was without a substantial exercise program, was simply showing an improvement of their overall physiologic state. Another area amenable to regeneration supplementation is heart failure. And for an understanding, the normal heart pumps roughly 50 to 65% of the blood in the chamber with each beat. If that drops below 50%, it's considered mild heart failure. Below 40% is moderate, and below 30% is severe heart failure. And below 20%, it's end stage. And there, if one doesn't get a heart transplant or a ventricular assist device, quality of life and prognosis are both very poor. So we did a clinical study giving 6 grams of laser-enhanced amino acids, and this was all the amino acids, all 20, in the biological ratio that matches egg white protein with some additional glycine for taste. And this was entitled Study of the Use of the Amino Acid Complex Complete Aminos for the Treatment of Chronically Damaged Heart Tissue. And this was in the journal Klinicheskaya Gerontologia, or Clinical Gerontology. And there again, my co-author was Dr. Vladimir Fedorov. So to understand the utility of what the laser photobiomodulation is doing, this is a study of immune cells called macrophages from mice. Macrophages basically by root means macro is large and phage means eat. So these are the big eaters. These are those cells that in Fantastic Voyage, when the ship was rising, ate the bad guy and swallowed the ship while all the good guys escaped. And to understand this model, the production of the inflammatory cytokine tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF alpha, was roughly at a level of 200 in the unstimulated cells. When they were given the herb that we know is immune boosting called echinacea, TNF alpha roughly tripled to 583. When those cells were fed the untreated amino acids, it further increased TNF alpha quite significantly, statistically as well, to over 1,500. So a roughly further 2.5-fold increase in the inflammatory chemistry in the body. In contrast, giving the laser-treated amino acids, there was no significant increase over the baseline elevation. So this suggests that if there's already an inflammatory state, amino acids may actually aggravate that inflammation, which isn't good. Whereas if the amino acids undergo this treatment process, that inflammation is reduced. Roughly 11-fold reduction of the pro-inflammatory effect that was not statistically significant from the baseline stimulated level. And what we saw over the 30 days of the study is that the placebo group had a small but not significant reduction of shortness of breath with exertion, where there was a dramatic, statistically significant of exertional shortness of breath in the group that got the active amino acids. Shortness of breath at rest didn't change in the placebo group, where it was completely eliminated in the treated group, also significant statistically. What was particularly relevant was that ventricular rhythm disturbance, which is a life-threatening complication of a failing heart, actually increased statistically significantly in the control group. In contrast, there was a very significant reduction, or looking at the relative numbers, a potentially 90% reduction in the risk of a life-threatening ventricular arrhythmia. The ejection fraction was mildly reduced over 1 month in the control group, whereas in the treated group, we saw a very significant 25% increase that was also statistically significant. Now, what this shows is the relative proportions of mild heart failure in blue, moderate in green, and severe in red. And the before and after, as you can see, shows no real significant difference in the control group before and after 30 days. In contrast, the before and after in the treated group is very significant. We see a significant reduction in both mild and moderate, but no particular change in severe. And we see a significant new color, which is the color purple. And what this shows is that roughly 60% of the subjects improved to normal or nearly heart function just taking an activated amino acid for 30 days. To show we are actually improving protein metabolism, we see that collagen production in the blue had no significant change in the control group, but between the 5th and 10th day, there was a statistically significant increase in metabolism and generation in the body, which by the 30th day was roughly double that of the control group. So if you want to have nice tight skin and more collagen and better blood vessels and bones, this is a great thing to take. And what's especially interesting, based on international criteria for stem cell studies and heart failure, that these results more than double the accepted criterion for an effective treatment for that issue. For those of you that are really interested in the consciousness side of the equation, there is a formulation called GEMPOWER, which stands for Greatly Enhanced Meridian Power, which that is its own discussion, and there's a 6-minute video on all the things. The two elements that are the most relevant, that this is our first formulation that combines nutrition with what we would call the white light interdimensional laser, which is a combination of frequencies that gives the pattern of white light. So it's particularly about enhancing one's energetic field and creating a very high balance of body, mind, and being. It also contains the so-called monoatomic gold, the esoteric white powder of gold sought by the alchemists, which has been associated with extremes of longevity in the mystery schools, as well as other monoatomic elements, the so-called platinum transition group, platinum, iridium, and rhodium, as well as osmium, each of which have profound effects on enhancement of cognitive function and awareness, a type of symphony of enhanced cognition and consciousness, as it were, as well as a very unique entity known as monoatomic oxygen, which has a sole source, one of my very high-level research colleagues. Now, you may ask, what is the evidence that this laser enhancement process actually improves bioavailability? Our best evidence from that is agricultural studies. And here we see ordinary corn. And if you look at the leaves, you see there's just a little tiny sprinkling of fine hairs there. Well, if these are fed the laser enhanced agricultural nutrients, which are nutritional components as well as a protein source from seaweed and probiotics that are good for plants, this basic corn becomes very hairy corn. And the reason very hairy corn is relevant is that the little hairs are about the fixation of nitrogen. And my colleague in Mexico, with whom we did these studies, which were a 2,500 acre study The first year increased to a 5,000 acre study, a very large study as agro goes, 10 is usually considered enough. And this was done by grants from the government of Mexico. We saw very significant results. So, and in particular, this nitrogen fixing phenomenon, my colleague found that he could reduce by 80% the amount of chemical nitrates that were required to get not only the same yields, but significantly increased yields. And this is an example. This particular hybrid of corn normally is about 200 grams, and here we see a very robust, roughly 750 gram cob. In terms of our large agricultural study, we see the control, which would be sort of the 100% level. And in agriculture, a 7% increase in yield is considered significant. So this formula, which is a foliar, which is sprayed on the leaves and stems and is really good for the soil as well. The formula itself showed a 22% increase in yield, which is already considered very good. But what's extremely relevant, applying the identical formula, but with laser enhancement, we saw a 3-fold relative increase in the yield to 60%. So that was a lot more good GMO beans. But not only did we see an increase in the yield, we also saw an improvement in micronutrient density. So the big problems we know we have is that soils have become depleted through industrial farming, so that the mineral content of food has become less and less over time. So here we see the effect on zinc, for example, whereas the control level was 8 parts per million in the sap, after the foliar nutrition, it was doubled to 17.5, which is already excellent. But given the same formula in the laser enhanced version, we saw a further doubling to a level of 40. So there was roughly 5 times the zinc compared to control using the laser enhanced agricultural nutrients. And that was a similar phenomenon. We saw that, for example, iron was doubled with adding the untreated nutrients, but was roughly also 5 times greater with the laser enhanced version. The copper level was actually increased by a factor of 5-fold more from just the foliar to the laser activated foliar. So this is an indication of the degree to which actual bioavailability and transfer of nutrients can be enhanced with this laser process. And here we see the copper values, which actually wasn't even detectable in the control, which rose to 1.5 ppm with the foliar nutrients and was 5-fold increased with the laser enhanced version to 7.5. So that's from the nutritional side. And the book Growing Younger will give a lot more information in detail about the studies and the implications for personal health, well-being, and enhancement. The next I'd like to describe briefly is psycho-emotional medicine, the importance of our psyche, and that we carry conflicts from our life as well as even from our ancestors, which predispose to certain conditions if those aren't addressed. And a particular version that is very powerful is called biological decoding, which has the premise that a disease is a word spoken not with the mouth, but with the body. So that if one experiences a severe stress, lived in isolation, that conflict tends to literally go to a specific metaphorically guided part of the brain, which then relates to a condition that may occur in the body. I'm just going to provide one example of this, that this next video is a person who had a frozen shoulder for 7 months, went to many specialists. They said nothing could really be done. It might get better in 2 years. A worst case scenario, she might need a shoulder replacement surgery. And what you'll see is the result of doing this process, which was the result of just asking 3 questions in the right way.
So about 7 months ago, my body developed a frozen shoulder, a condition where you can't really raise your hand. And so before I spoke to Dr. Todd today, my shoulder was stuck like that. I really couldn't move it. But then Dr. Todd actually did some decoding. So he asked me a couple of psychological questions. And then he said, now do like this. Oh my God, that's unbelievable. I couldn't do it before. I mean, it's like a miracle. I could place it over like that. Oh my God. And it happened in like less than 2 minutes of our conversation. You are a miracle worker.
Thank
So
you. We're so
much.
excited it's better.
Thank you.
So isn't that interesting? Just asking 3 questions, the right questions in the right way, resulted in that dramatic benefit of the mobility of what had been a frozen shoulder. And to really understand that certainly would require more discussion than we have the time for today. And I'm going to encourage you to get the Growing Younger book and sign up for our newsletters, which we're so busy, those aren't so frequent, so we don't inundate you. And on 11/11, which is a significant date, I'm going to provide a video that describes the 3 questions, gives the questions and the rationale for them so that you could learn how to provide this result yourself. And then there's a whole level of training that we offer with the world's leading pioneers in this area so that you can literally learn the entire psycho-emotional landscape of the body and how to use it. And before we get to stem cells, I'm going to talk about what would be the area of vocal higher dimensional vibrations. And this is an area in an art that I call pineal tones. These are types of chants and tones that are designed to stimulate and resonate with the pineal, which is that highest center associated with the crown, which when opened is called the opening of the 1,000-petaled lotus of enlightenment. Our first major choir, which had over 900 singers, was done on the island of Maui on the date of the end of the Mayan calendar, December 21st, 2012. A Lemurian Choir, as it were, ancient sounds for the future. And this was one of the 2 large groups of singers, actually 2 groups of about 500 to 600 that sang that day. And this was the first recreation of such a ceremony we understood from an intuitive source, the first time in 26,000 years, a full galactic cycle. And to show the impact of these tones, this is work from Dr. Masaru Emoto, who wrote the book Hidden Messages in Water. And he gave us a very difficult control. He said, anyone can make a nice crystal in distilled water, but almost nothing creates a nice crystal in Tokyo tap water. And this is the 3rd level of the pineal tones. And what we see is not only a beautiful crystal, but if you count, we see 3 sets of 3 points. And this tone level has literally 3 sets of 3 syllables. So this unique crystal with 6 sides and 9 points, I've looked at hundreds of these images and have not seen another one like it, is based on literally the acoustics of conditioning that information into water. Distilled water is a blank template. And in distilled water, we saw this extraordinary Star of David-like pattern, which 3-dimensionalized is the Merkabah. So this star tetrahedron keeps coming up and up, whether it's in molecular biochemistry and the shape of molecules, whether it's the shape of water, or if it's so-called vehicles of higher dimensional transport called the Merkabah. And this is the pattern, and I'll just sing it for you to give you a feel for what these tones sound like. Zo, po, lo, om, lo, no, mo, no. And I'll play a recording from the choir with hundreds of people singing each part. We have an artist named Deborah DeLisi who, with each of these tone patterns, sees profound interdimensional imagery. And this was the art she created for level 3, which is filled with the intention of returning to the seed sound of creation, or the om that's present in the syllables. And what's particularly fascinating is that at the top you see that recurring star tetrahedron form. And she created this art before we got the crystals from Dr. Emoto. So when you get multiple lines of evidence suggesting the same thing, you get an idea that there's at least something synchronistically there. For those of you who may be interested, our next and possibly final choir, actually intentionally the final choir of this series before it evolves somewhere else. Over the course of time since 2012, there have been the activation of 12 nodal points of the Earth and their corresponding null points, creating a whole planetary system. And the intention of this final choir, the Aloha Choir, which will be on the relevant numerologic dates, 11/11/22, is going to be to activate and integrate the whole system as an engine of accelerated planetary clearing, boosted vibration and consciousness. So now we conclude with stem cells. In the very first experiment we did with this new type of interdimensional laser, we took a type of stem cell-like cell from the bone marrow, and we applied the laser signal to it for different periods of time, from 5 to 60 minutes. And 24 hours later, saw something extraordinary after removing the laser, which was the cells lined up where the beam had been. Whereas my colleague said you might get 8 to 16 of these cells clumped together, that she saw what were probably millions of cells in a coherent lineup of cells that was so big you could see it with the naked eye. So we had stumbled upon, as it were, literally the song of the stem cells, a vibrational pattern to attract stem cells where we'd like them to go. So what is a stem cell? These are cells that have the ability to divide and create an identical copy of themselves, which is called self-renewal. And they can leave that pool and mature into every type of cell in the body for cell replacement. So if your stem cells are really great, that in theory, a large enough dose of robust stem cells could regenerate almost any damaged or degenerated tissue in the body, as well as the potential capacity to reset the biologic age clock of cells and tissues, including DNA aging clocks. And that may give us a whole new realm of almost unlimited potential for healthy, youthful longevity. The main challenges in stem cell therapy are getting the cells where you want them to be, and even if they get there, to have them stay there, and then achieving the desired regenerative effect. With this laser guidance process, we create a signal that goes much more deeply through tissue than ordinary laser. And in the wavelengths we use that are in the red band, that usually only goes about 5 millimeters through tissue. And we've patented work that suggests we can increase that by at least 10 to 20 with the visible part of the waveform. The invisible part may well go all the way through the body from one side to the other, literally singing the song of the stem cells in light, to go there, stay there, and regenerate there. We've actually measured that it increases cell adhesion molecule expression, so the cells can not only go there, but actually stick. And when cells adhere to each other, that is also a basis for how the cells talk to each other, so the stem cells can be directed of the type of cell they need to be in that tissue. So what this process does, it allows us to awaken dormant cells first and condition them to the homing signal. And after they're given intravenously, we can then literally guide the cell with a tissue we give through the skin, a signal we give through the skin, that increases the likelihood that a cell goes three-dimensionally in the body where we want it. What's extraordinary is that now we can do this process just using the person's peripheral blood as a source of stem cells. What's amazing is that there's a type of cell that is very powerful, just past embryonic, that is called very small embryonic-like stem cells that for mysterious reasons go into hibernation when we're born. And maybe the reason Methuselah could live to be 969 and we don't is that at that time, maybe these cells didn't go to sleep. Maybe they stayed awake and exerted their longevity effects throughout life. On December 10th of last year, we published a landmark article in this work in the journal Cell R4, which stands for Repair, Replacement, Regeneration, and Reprogramming, which was the action of modulated laser light on human very small embryonic-like stem cells in platelet-rich plasma. So we showed that almost immediately after doing this laser stimulation process with this unique type of waveform, that the cell counts were already 2.5 times greater, and our total counts were many times that of other people working in this area. And much more important than the cells actually being increased in number was that they had been awakened. We were very pleased. In the past 6 to 8 months, we've learned about the most precise method of assessing biologic age that exists. It's called True Diagnostic True Age, that instead of looking at 2,000 methylation points on DNA, which gave some estimate of age, now looks at 900,000 methylation points and gives one's biologic age at the DNA level to 2 decimal places. Now, because we are working on a publication, I'm not able to reveal the extent of this. And I'll tell you that the company that does this test, one of their founders actually called us because, as he said, our results were orders of magnitude better statistically than anyone else doing this testing. So that gives an indication, at this very accurate test of biologic age at the DNA level, that this methodology with this unique type of stem cell, these literally newborn caliber cells that circulate in our blood till we awaken them for our benefit from them, that we are literally reversing the biologic aging clock more profoundly than has ever been possible in medical history. And I'll share just one example, which is particularly profound. This is someone who did 2 of these VSCL treatments and then combined it with other anti-aging, age reversal technologies in the art. And his results after 6 months were an astounding 10-year reversal of his epigenetic biologic age at the DNA level. And his telomere length biology was actually 14 years younger after 6 months. So that is an indicator of what's possible. And of course, if one does these things repeatedly, we may literally slow, stop, and reverse the aging process. This is so profound that we may be entering for the first time in modern medical history the capacity to literally dial an age. So whatever age you want to be, using these modalities as we evolve them and make them even better, we may be able to create and sustain a biological age almost anywhere we would like. For those who might be interested in these age reversal methodologies, the name of our clinic is Kegenics, and you can connect with and get information at info@kegenics.com, or call the number below 844-347-4737. And those of you who really are interested in becoming more and more enhanced versions of yourself, I encourage you to get the book Growing Younger, the free download there again at drtado.com/humanity, with the formulations available at Germatria.com. And our work goes beyond stem cells, metabolism, and nutrition. Our goal, as I believe many of yours is not even just longevity or even longevity in youthful bodies. It's really the full expansion of the human potential, what we can be and become physically, mentally, emotionally, and most of all, spiritually and in consciousness. And I'd like to conclude by taking us again down the central core of DNA, which is a mandala-like structure. You can imagine the ancient rishis meditating on a hillside, looking deep within, seeing mandalas. They're probably looking at their own internal DNA down the core. So thank you so much for all of your attention. Really much appreciated, and look forward to Jim coming back on and seeing what further questions you may have.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you so much. This was both spellbinding and highly technical, and I know you have a hard stop about now, so I won't keep you. But I'd like to schedule a follow-up event with you so that we could get into some of the questions. There's been some very profound questions, both about environmental pollution like 5G, cell towers all over the place, and how that affects us. There's also been a number of questions about, the 3 questions that you asked that woman with the frozen arm, and also about, exactly the nature of the therapy that you're providing. So I think maybe we leave it as is for now today, and let everybody just kind of take in what you've shared. People have your number and your email, and then let's schedule a time, maybe in a month or so, where you could come on and we just have a question and answer, because what you're proposing is kind of mind-boggling in its import. And I think everyone will be very eager to circle back for a deeper dive. Does that sound okay for you?
That sounds fantastic. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, that allows us, a more leisurely discussion of some of the issues that you're raising. But this is fascinating, my friend. This is absolutely fascinating. I think all of us want to sign up. I mean, who doesn't want to live younger? I mean, who on planet Earth wouldn't want to live younger, healthier, and more robustly at this point?
For sure. Younger, smarter, fitter, faster. Yep.
Well, good. Well, thank you, everyone. And then we'll have Todd back, and probably in October, we'll get a suitable date. So hold that thought, as it were, in that question that you got. And then I just want to let everybody to know that tomorrow is 9/11. It's the 20th anniversary of the bombing of the Twin World Trade Towers and the Pentagon by Al-Qaeda. It also marks, the ending of the Afghan War a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to be beginning an 11-day Humanity Rising partnership with 11 days of global unity. And every day starting tomorrow through the 21st of September, we're going to be contemplating what it takes to bring the world together in this very, very challenging time. And I think, so that's at the same time. It will be at 8 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. We're going to start tomorrow with a tribute to Avon Madison, one of the great peace workers and activists of our contemporary generation. So there's a very, very robust and dynamic program. We're going to be offering scholarships to our Masters in Regenerative Action and our BA in Global Skills and Regeneration. We'll be talking more about the regeneration, the Global Regeneration Corps. So it's going to be a very exciting 11 days on Humanity Rising with literally hundreds of organizations around the world that are partnering with us. But what I would say as we bring this session to a close, you know, Todd, what you're raising into public consciousness, particularly in and through the Lemurian chanting, is, I believe, at the heart of what humanity has to remember from the past in order to move into the future. And so if you just spontaneously, because we didn't discuss this before, but could we end our program with you just offering a Lemurian chant that could activate our cellular memory of our true humanity?
I'd love to.
Please.
So for that, I recommend beginning from the beginning, the first level, which has the intention of remembering your divine eternal perfection. And here we go. Om.
Thank you, my friend.
My pleasure.
Take it in, everyone. We've just gone back 26,000 years. And that is the consciousness we need to re-quicken to embrace the full potential of what Todd has shared today. Thank you, Todd.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you here again on Humanity Rising tomorrow, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Bye for now.